What's up, everybody? Demon back. Welcome to a brand new video, and today we're going to be doing the Godzilla-Thon for 1984's Godzilla. That's just, there's no special title for it. It's just Godzilla. It was the reboot. It was the start of the Heisei series. I'm so glad we're done with the Showa series because honestly, the longer it goes on, it just gets hard to watch. It's so repetitive. So it's good to get this mix up. You really get taken back to the way Godzilla was when it very first started out. I think this is a very much needed return to form at this point in the series, and I'm glad that they took it in this direction, making it more serious again. This movie is really kind of a political movie. Much in the way that Shin Godzilla is. Shin Godzilla is kind of the spiritual remake of this movie, and we'll talk about that a lot when we get to Shin Godzilla, but for the most part, Godzilla 1984, it really is a much needed return to form. So this movie ignores everything that happened after the 1954 movie, so you only have Gojira came before this, and then this one comes, so this is the sequel. And then everything else from the Showa series is no longer in this continuity. Like I said, this is the second era. This is the Heisei era. So this is honestly one of my favorite eras, especially because I'm not very familiar with it. Now, that kind of is a problem with this movie because I'll get into my personal connection to this movie, seeing as though it's kind of interesting. I hunted this movie down for years and years and years. I tried so hard to find it because it wasn't being distributed in America back when I was looking for it. It recently got a release on Blu-ray, but before that, I actually wound up getting it on DVD a few months before it was released in America on Blu-ray. Now, I looked for this movie forever. I could never find it. This is the last Godzilla movie I ever got, and that is still true to this day. I still have not received my copy of Shin Godzilla. It hasn't come in the mail yet, so technically speaking, Godzilla 1984 is the last Godzilla movie I ever got. It's also the last one I ever saw before Shin Godzilla. So I don't really have any deep emotional connection with this movie, which is kind of a problem because the fact that I don't have a deep connection with it and the fact that I hunted it down for years and years, and then when I finally watched it, I realized it's not a very fast-paced or entertaining movie. I was a little bit disappointed. So watching it again, I think the first time I watched it, I really liked it. I didn't have any problems with it, but watching it again, there are some major issues that we'll talk about here. It's not a bad movie by any means. I like it, but there are some major issues that stand out when you watch it. We're going to go through the plot like we always do. It's a really in-depth plot like usual. So we start out, we have this awesome opening where you just see the Japanese writing for Godzilla come on screen very slowly. You see volcanoes erupting in the background. It's great. I love it. The English cut does something similar to that. And also, we're not going to talk about the 85 version with Raymond Burr in this review. That will actually be saved for next week's Godzilla-Thon. So, volcanoes going off. It's really good. That also ties into the plot because months later, a ship wrecks near a volcanic area. The ship is investigated the next day. When the ship wrecks, though, there is a roar. You hear Godzilla's roar, and as it's revealed later, it was him coming out of the rock. So, I think that's what we're supposed to assume. The ship is investigated the next day, but no one is found. No one's found on board. Some dead bodies are found eaten away. They're just kind of rotted corpses, and they're all hollowed out or whatever, I guess you could say, because it basically everything got sucked out of them, and they're just these shells, human shells. It's pretty disturbing. So they turn up on the lower deck of the boat. This whole sequence is done very similar to the way that horror movies do their sequences, with it being very slow, very tension-filled. There's a great creepy atmosphere. This strange sea creature is found, and it attacks our main character who's investigating the boat. It attacks him, and it's actually killed by the only survivor from the boat. He was like hidden away inside this locker, I think. I can't quite tell. It's like a locker or a closet or a pantry. He's hidden inside of it, and that's where he survived the night. He actually kills the thing with a cleaver. It's revealed that it was like a giant sea louse. The interesting thing about it is that I don't know how many people noticed this, but it actually has Kamakras's roar, so it's kind of a cool use of a stock roar. The survivor reveals that the strange monster rose from a rock at night. It was just a massive monster. He keeps saying how terrible it was. The sea louse that mutated and attacked everyone on the boat, that killed everyone, it wound up coming off of this giant monster. The only survivor, his name is Okamura. He survived the shipwreck. He's the one who survived the shipwreck, and he actually identifies the monster as Godzilla. And I love the fact that they have photos of the 1954 attack that he's going through, and that's when he says, "Oh shoot, that thing that showed up last night, that was Godzilla." And then the government freaks out because obviously Godzilla caused a lot of damage in 1954. So now, being 1984, 30 years later, they're really worried that Godzilla is going to come back onshore and cause a ton more damage. So it turns out the sea louse grew so big, because it was like a 3-foot sea louse, and then we actually hear about 5-foot sea louses later on. So it turns out that the thing grew so big because it was feeding off Godzilla's radioactive blood, which is a really great use of the radioactivity. One thing that this movie does really well, I think, is gives you a really good fear of nuclear energy, and that is exactly what the very first movie did. It was basically a warning about nuclear bombs. This movie is still that exact same thing. It is just an allegory on nuclear bombs. And the sea louse and Godzilla himself, as well as the Russians, what they do later on in the movie, is just really good at setting that up. Now, the sea louse, the fact that it grew so big because of radioactivity, it was mutated, and then it came on board and killed all these people, obviously establishes a fear of what nuclear radiation can do to a creature. Obviously, that's not realistic, but in the movie, that's what they're afraid of. And it is trying to exploit the fears of the audience, who are also worried about that kind of thing. So I just think this movie does a really good job at connecting the allegory back to the original 54 movie, but at the same time, this one's also kind of more political than the 54 movie in a lot of ways. The 54 movie didn't dive into politics at all, really. You had Yamane, who was upset because they were going to kill Godzilla, but that was more scientific than political. You had one good scene of people arguing whether to announce the fact that Godzilla was created by the atomic bomb or not. That was probably the most political thing we see in the whole movie at the press conference, and that's when Yamane kind of gets upset at everyone. In this movie, the whole movie is politics, and that's kind of a problem because I don't find it interesting like I do a Shin Godzilla way, where I'm really invested in the politics and I actually care about it. I don't think this movie does as good a job at making you care about what's happening as Shin Godzilla did, and I know a lot of people don't like what Shin Godzilla did, but for me personally, that one worked, whereas this one doesn't quite work as well. But overall, I do actually like this movie, so I don't want to come off as too harsh here. So it is found out that the volcano from the start of the movie is what woke up this new Godzilla. It's never actually specifically stated in this movie that Godzilla is a new creature and not the one from 1954. The English cut of this movie does a worse job at making it clear that this is a different Godzilla. And we'll get there next week, but you actually have to wait for later in the Heisei series for them to explain that there was a Godzilla in 1954 that got killed, then there was this Godzilla. The audience should know, like, if you've seen both movies, you should know that this is a new Godzilla, because the original Godzilla disintegrated into bones and then eventually disintegrated into nothing. But this movie doesn't really ever make that clear that Godzilla died, because they always talk about how this is Godzilla returning to Tokyo, whereas they should say this is a new Godzilla coming to Tokyo just like the old one did. That's one thing that I think even Godzilla Raids Again does a better job at, is distinguishing between the Godzilla from 1954 and the Godzilla from 1955. That movie does a really good job at making it very clear. The one from 54, completely dead. This is a new creature. And even the final line of 1954 should explain this as a new Godzilla, because the final line is Yamane saying, if we continue to use nuclear bombs, then there will be another Godzilla. Here we are 30 years later, new Godzilla comes on shore. So I wouldn't get that confused if I were you. I know a lot of people are very confused about the timeline due to what happens in King Ghidorah. We'll explain that when we get there for our review in a couple weeks, but all you need to know for right now is that this is a new Godzilla. So, the Prime Minister, he decides to put a ban on the press so they cannot talk about the appearance of Godzilla. This is a very realistic thing to do for the government to try and hide a situation for as long as possible in order to avoid panic. I really do like that. The reporter, the guy who investigated the boat from the start, his name is Maki. Presumably, I think it's Maki Goro or Goro Maki, but they call him Maki throughout the whole movie. He finds out his story about his investigation on the boat and what he discovered cannot be printed because the monster that he was going to print the story about is actually Godzilla. And so, in order to avoid panic, like I just said, the government decided to withhold that information. We find out a little bit more of the economical backings behind this, of why they didn't release the information about Godzilla. It's because the news would cause a worldwide panic, which would force the stock market to collapse, because investors would, pull out of Japan because they know that Japan's going to be attacked if Godzilla's right next to it. The people would stop buying stocks and they'd start focusing on basically either evacuating, getting out of the country, or survival. And so they're really worried that there was going to be an economic downfall if Godzilla comes on land. We never really necessarily get into the economics of what happens after Godzilla shows up in the later Heisei movies, but we do get into more of the scientific background of what happens as a result of Godzilla showing up, and that is really well done in the Godzilla vs. Biollante from 1989. That we'll get there in 2 weeks from now. So for now, Goro goes to talk to this professor. The professor's name is Hayashida. He goes to talk to him about Godzilla. So the professor explains that in 1954, both his parents were killed by Godzilla, which is what made him a scientist. At first, he wanted to study Godzilla so that he could find a way to kill him. Now he realizes that Godzilla is not necessarily the bad guy after all. He is just a product of human mistake. And I really love the fact that he says men are the only real monsters. So, after time, he stopped wishing to kill Godzilla, but instead now he wants to just study Godzilla, which is also a very interesting thing. And it's a great parallel to Yamane, who wanted to study Godzilla. He really didn't want Godzilla to be killed because he knew that Godzilla was a valuable scientific discovery and Godzilla could be studied. There was a lot that could be done with Godzilla, and the fact that Godzilla survived a nuclear bomb, that is what Yamane wanted to know so badly, was how is that possible? Now in this movie, you have a character who basically says, his character's name, like I said, is Hayashida. Hayashida basically says, alright, this thing can't die, like there's nothing we can build that will kill it. Actually, we find out later in the movie that's not true, because they essentially do kill Godzilla. But he says, nothing we can build will kill this thing. This thing's basically indestructible. We're all pretty screwed with the weaponry that we have, so there's no real point in trying to kill it. The only thing we can do is try and figure it out and study it. And then Raymond Burr, his character in the English cut, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about it, and I keep subtly mentioning it, not so subtly, I guess. But in the English cut, Burr basically gives a very similar speech about how Godzilla's a force of nature, and you should probably try and not kill it because you're not going to succeed. So I think that's also really well handled. So Goro explains to Neko, I believe that's her name. She is the sister of Okamura, and he explains to her that her brother is still alive and is in isolation due to him seeing Godzilla. They don't want all the news getting out. They don't want the survivor. They don't want his story getting out, and the fact that the boat sank, or not necessarily sank, but was the crew was killed because of Godzilla. They basically keep him in hiding because they don't want to cause a panic. Russian nuclear sub is attacked by Godzilla, who sets the Soviets on red alert. This is a really great thing, too, because he sets the Soviets on red alert against America. This is very shortly after the Cold War. So America and Russia, there was still extreme tensions between the two countries. Now, America is actually blamed for Godzilla attacking the sub, which is very real world. Now, back then, like I just said, there was a lot of tensions between the two countries. So when Godzilla shows up, they assume it's just a new type of American submarine, and they try to sink it. They try and bomb him. But Godzilla just keeps coming at them, and then they think that the submarine's going to wind up ramming them, and they're all worried, and then Godzilla actually just destroys the submarine and sinks it. First of all, nuclear subs will come back into play in a later movie in this series, and they will have a very different effect on Godzilla, because in this movie it doesn't affect him at all. He just keeps trucking along. But in the later movies, it's actually going to mutate him further. So I'm interested to know why in this movie. Maybe just they never thought of it, but in this movie he doesn't actually get affected by it, where in the later movie he does. But what I'm trying to say here is this is a really great real-world moment where it's great for the reason that it would actually happen. If some giant monster that they couldn't identify came at the Russian sub back then, they would guarantee blame us Americans. Um, the thing is, though, that it's not necessarily a happy real world connection because that's not a good thing. The Cold War didn't end on a positive note, um, and it didn't. No one necessarily lost or won. It just kind of ended due to it couldn't continue anymore. It was just too expensive. So, and if you want to know more about it, you can do your own research on it. But one thing that this movie does a really good job at is having Godzilla force America and Russia, basically force them to come together. One thing that this movie does really well is to establish Godzilla as a world threat so that the world will have to come together to fight him. They don't really have time for personal arguments to be like, oh, I don't like your country. They basically have to set that all aside and say, let's focus on Japan, let's focus on keeping Japan safe because this giant monster could destroy them. The giant monster could also destroy any other country. So they all have to focus on Godzilla, which is a really great thing that they do coming up. The Prime Minister lets America and Russia in on the situation because he wants to avoid a war between the two countries. He knows that it was Godzilla who sank the submarine, and so in an attempt to basically cool the two countries down, he has to give that information which he had been hiding throughout the movie because he realizes that a war is going to start if he doesn't, which is also really great. This Prime Minister in this movie, he's a really smart character, and he has great morals coming up in a later debate when he talks to Russia and America about how, listen, I really appreciate you guys wanting to help, but you have to understand you are not allowed to nuke our country. Like, this is not going to happen. We have a very strict no nuclear bomb policy. You're going to violate it. That's not cool. It's not going to go down the way you want it to. You're not going to be able to drop these bombs on Godzilla. So I think he's a great character. Now, the Prime Minister in Shin Godzilla is like the exact opposite of him, which is another reason why Shin Godzilla is awesome. That movie's just great. So the information's let out, the media blackout is lifted. Japan plans to use their new weapon called the Super X against Godzilla. It is armed with these things called cadmium missiles. These cadmium missiles basically deplete the nuclear energy inside of Godzilla. They basically drain him of all his energy and power, so he can't really do anything. They can't kill him, as it's stated later in the movie, but they do a lot of damage. Now, the army searches for Godzilla. There's great music, great montage here. I really do like this theme. We'll talk about the music here coming up later because I'm not necessarily fond of it, but this theme in particular is really, really good. Now, they search for Godzilla in the ocean. Meanwhile, back at the nearby nuclear factory, some giant monster, Godzilla, comes on land. He makes landfall when they are out searching for him, which is another really, really cool thing because Godzilla's landfall in this movie is handled a little bit different than it's handled in other movies where it's kind of mysterious. You just hear something in the fog and then you slowly see him come out. You have this really great shot of a person. He's walking outside of the factory and the floor splits open around him, which is very, very realistic. If a giant monster that size was going to come on land, it definitely would cause that kind of damage where the floor around him would split open. You also get some really good sense of scale in this scene because there's some really great shots of people running away from the factory and you see Godzilla in the background and he is just towering over it. The special effects in this movie range anywhere from pretty awful to great because this is one of those really great special effects. I think whenever we see Godzilla kind of up close, it doesn't look as good, but for the most part, he looks pretty fine in the movie. The animatronic doesn't look as good, and then the suit from certain angles looks pretty bad, but for the most part, Godzilla does actually look pretty cool in this movie, and the special effects are really updated. They're great. The Super X, whenever it flies around, it looks really good. Like, the directing of the movie, I don't necessarily like. I think it's kind of shot too soap opera-y, but for the monster stuff, I think it gives you a really good sense of scale. Just seeing Godzilla tower over these buildings, you actually have real shots of Tokyo with Godzilla inserted into these real shots of Tokyo. They work really, really well to establish a real sense of scale. And that's one thing that previous Godzilla movies just didn't have the technology to do. And scale is something that will become a big deal in Godzilla movies to come. I mean, it is played up upon a ton in Godzilla 2014. There's some other movies that do a really good job of establishing a sense of scale. But Godzilla himself isn't actually all that big in this movie. One of my bigger complaints about this movie is that Godzilla doesn't necessarily feel like he's all that threatening. He comes on land, he wipes out the military, but you see he's not anywhere near as big as the buildings around him, which is just a byproduct of humans being able to build buildings bigger than they were in 1954. Godzilla is no longer going to be the top dog anymore. If there's buildings over 150 feet nowadays, which there were back in the 80s, he is just not going to be that impressive looking around his area. And the fact that they didn't scale him up a lot, it really does make Godzilla seem a little bit less menacing, which is why that, as well as just for special effects convenience, later on in this series, they're going to beef Godzilla up to really, really high heights in order to make him more menacing. And it definitely works there. And in this movie, he's still menacing. You just don't get the sense that he's going to be able to level Tokyo as thoroughly as he was in 1954. Anyways, Godzilla destroys the power plant. He takes the radioactive core. I love that because it's one thing that we've never seen throughout the series is Godzilla having to feed. So Godzilla comes on land in search for food. He pulls out the radioactive core and then he just consumes all the energy that comes out of it. He absorbs it. Great scene. His dorsal fins are going freaking crazy. They're lighting up blue and you hear them charging up because all this energy is just flowing inside his body. It really is, it's him eating. It's a great scene. You also get something similar to that in Godzilla Rulers of Earth. There's a scene when they talk about, there's a page when they talk about, there was like a submarine or something along those lines that went missing. It was a nuclear submarine, and then all of a sudden Godzilla comes on land and he's holding the reactor core and he drops it on the ground as he comes on land because he is feeding off the radiation underwater. It's so well done because I don't know. I just really like that. I like that aspect, and I love the fact that the dorsal fins, which it's never stated why they are the way they are up until Shin Godzilla, and even then, Shin Godzilla's biology is vastly different from previous Godzillas, so you can't really compare the two, but it is kind of implied that all the Godzillas, their dorsal fins, kind of work as almost, I don't know, a ventilation system for the radiation. Maybe that's where it comes in and out. Because anytime he does his atomic breath, you see them light up. They charge up on his back, and then the breath comes out of his mouth. But in Shin Godzilla, it's also explained that that's a ventilation system for not only his blood, but the nuclear fission inside his body. So I really, really think that's great. That is so great. So the fact that you see them all going crazy when he's eating this is a really nice little detail that I'm glad made it into this movie. Some birds fly past Godzilla, and then he decides to turn and start following them. We find out that Godzilla has a homing beacon inside his body, inside his brain, just like birds do for natural migration. So Godzilla, his brain basically, or at least the main navigation systems of his brain, basically works the same way birds do. So when he hears the flock of birds fly past, the frequency that they're transmitting for navigation, it affects his brain, so he decides to follow them as well. That's something that they use to exploit him as a weakness later on. It's pretty interesting. It's never played up on again in this whole series, which is interesting given the continuity base that this series has, which is very, very deep with continuity and everything flows together really well. Although they never play up on this angle again of Godzilla having this bird brain where he can, basically they can exploit it as a weakness anytime they want, which is him just being attracted to the frequency that these birds transmit because that's just kind of the way his biology works. They also explain that it's because dinosaurs are the most closely related to birds are in terms of evolution, so it makes sense that he would have the same sort of navigational system as birds. Pretty interesting. We don't really get a lot of information about the biology of Godzilla throughout this movie. Later on, we'll get some more information about like the secondary brain that he has and stuff like that, but in this movie, we don't really get a ton of it. We just get the fact that, yeah, there's a little thingy in his brain that is similar to birds. So the human cast figures out that they can force this volcano to erupt. They can force a volcanic eruption by planting some explosives inside the volcano. Then they plan to lure Godzilla into the volcano and trigger the eruption. So it's a very interesting plan, again created by scientists. One thing that this movie and 54 also do is have the military kind of do stuff that maybe works or maybe doesn't. With the high tension wires in 54, didn't really work, but then Godzilla does seem to be annoyed by like planes and jets and stuff when he's going back into the water. In this movie, the Super X does actually nearly kill him. So, I mean, the military does their job, but in both movies, it's actually scientists who have to come to save the day. In 54, it's Serizawa with the oxygen destroyer. He actually takes his life when using it, whereas in this movie, it is Hayashida and his bird transmitter that gets Godzilla into the volcano. So I'm going to kind of skip around through the plot here just to get rid of all this kind of worthless stuff. It's really deep and interesting from a political, allegorical standpoint, but I don't necessarily think it works as well in this movie as it does in movies such as 54 and Shin Godzilla. So there's a lot of political talk. There is just a ton of... It's like boardroom meetings from the UN where they're talking about like, oh, we gotta blow up Godzilla or whatever. But it is, for the most part, uninteresting. So I'm gonna skip through about 20 minutes of the movie and get to get to the part when Godzilla makes landfall in Tokyo Bay. So Godzilla heads towards Tokyo Bay. Like I said, this is after all this discussion about how to proceed with Godzilla. He heads towards Tokyo Bay, where the military plans to... basically, they plan to ambush him. They set up this huge... I don't know how to describe it. Like a roadblock. They basically set up a roadblock where there is this massive lineup of tanks, a whole bunch of new weaponry. There's jets that are flying around Tokyo Bay, and then there's a Russian boat there that's armed with a nuclear bomb, or it's connected to a nuclear bomb that is controlled by satellite and is up in space. That's going to be a major plot point here in a second, because Godzilla comes to the military blockade. He wipes it out. So first thing he does, he attacks the jets because they attack him. There's some really weird things that he does. Like, I like it because it looks okay. I think the biggest downfall with this sequence is not only the sound design, but the pacing. That's something we'll talk about in a minute. But the sound design, you just don't get a sense of power from anything happening. The explosions all sound really muted and dull. They just kind of have a kind of sound to them. Godzilla's atomic breath used to kind of be more high-pitched and powerful. This one's just kind of... It's kind of lame. But Godzilla, like, spits out these tiny little versions of the atomic breath where he just kind of opens his mouth for a second and it just kind of flows out for a brief second. And they blow up these jets. So he destroys the jets. He dives into the ocean, causing the destruction of the Soviet ship in the area, forcing the nuclear missile to launch. There's a Russian on board who really, really tries to stop it, which is something we'll talk about next review. He really tries to stop it, but he fails. He winds up getting exploded and killed in the boat. Godzilla, for the first time, devastates the military with the atomic breath. It destroys everything. So Godzilla's atomic breath up to this point in the series has never really been that powerful. It does stuff. It sets stuff on fire and it melts stuff, but it's never been as powerful as it is in this movie. And then the Heisei series, later on, it'll just continue to grow more and more powerful up until the final entry of the series. But Godzilla's atomic breath, super incredibly strong in this movie compared to the Showa era. It is fail in comparison to what comes later in this series. And like I said, it is super powerful because he does wipe out the entire blockade in one blast of the atomic breath, which is a great scene when he just opens his mouth and kind of drags it from right to left and everything explodes and just gets completely demolished. It's a great scene, but the sound design is awful because it just kind of... really, really bad. I don't like it. They should have done something better. Godzilla destroys Tokyo, really slow paced, and then he fights the Super X. So after fighting the Super X, and they fire these flares in the sky because it annoys him, which is another great parallel to the 54 movie when Godzilla was annoyed by things that reminded him of the atomic bomb that deformed him. This movie has the same thing. They shoot these flares up because they annoy him. Also, Godzilla Raids again touched up on that with the flares in the sky to try and attract Godzilla from place to place. So Godzilla gets all mad and starts roaring. They fire these cadmium shells into his mouth. They explode, deplete the nuclear energy inside of him, and then he falls over because he's all pooped out, and they basically kill him. They knock him out at the very least, and then Hayashida says they can't kill him that easily, but you look at Godzilla, and it's like, yeah, if they continue to shoot these bombs, like, let's say they had 50 of these cadmium missiles, Godzilla would have definitely have died. So Godzilla's down for the count. One thing that I noticed was this scene really is slow. It's not... The 54 attack goes by really quick, and he destroys Tokyo super thoroughly. In this movie, you get the sense that Godzilla destroyed some stuff, but you never really see a ton of destruction on screen. You more of just see buildings broken around him after you cut to him after being on the human characters for a while, which is why I decided to attempt to try and make this scene a little bit more entertaining, because, like I said, it's slow-paced. The music really works against it. It's not entertaining music. It's slow, boring, kind of eerie build-up music. It really shouldn't be build-up music for the climax, but it's build-up music. The Super X's theme is pretty great, but like Godzilla destroying stuff is way too slow, doesn't make it entertaining to watch. I wondered, maybe it's the editing and the music, or maybe it's just a bad scene. So in order to test that out, I made two versions of this scene. There's the original, and then there's the two that I made. So first of all, I took it, re-edited it, so it's a lot quicker, so it basically works like the 54 attack, where you don't have to watch every step Godzilla takes. You mostly just will cut from angle to angle, and it makes it look like he's moving a lot quicker. That's what the 54 movie does. That's what I did with this in order to give it a much faster paced feel. It works because I took it, I re-edited it, and then I inserted Ifukube's Godzilla score into it. Now, I inserted a couple themes, and it works so well. Then I wondered what would happen if I took a much more darker score and tried to insert it in here. So I took the Shin Godzilla score and inserted it in. It works almost as well as the Ifukube one. I don't think it works as well, but it works almost as well. It gives the movie a much faster pace. It makes it more entertaining and more interesting to watch. So I think one thing that this movie really suffers from is the music lacking a lot. If they had a much more entertaining score, like the scores from Shin Godzilla or the score from Godzilla 1954, I think I used some other music, like the Terror of Mechagodzilla theme in there too. But generally, if they just took some Ifukube music, threw it into this sequence, it would have been so good. But instead, they had this kind of like dreary, like ominous sound when it really should be the climax. But I don't know. You guys can go check out my versions. I will play a clip of the Ifukube one here. And then I'll play a clip of the Shin Godzilla one now. If you're interested to see the full videos, I have them linked down below, or they're on my Facebook group for D-Man 1954 if you want to check out, like I said, the full videos. I have the full attack scene from Godzilla's landfall in Tokyo Bay, all the way through him getting knocked out by the Super X, re-edited, and then edited. I re-edited it, and then I inserted some new music in there, and then, there you go. I could not get that sentence out fluently. So, the bombs hit over Japan. Okay, alright. Getting back to the plot. That kind of was a weird sentence for me to throw back in. The bomb, the nuclear bomb that the Russians boat accidentally fired off, is headed straight for Japan. It's going into the atmosphere of Japan. When the Americans fire this missile and blow it up in the atmosphere, the sky turns red. Really, really freaky. The nuclear energy just falls down on everyone there. They probably all got cancer and are going to die, but they never say that. It revives Godzilla. It's great. So Godzilla stands up again. He's all re-energized. He fights the Super X, destroys it. He knocks it on the ground, which is great, and then he takes this big, huge building and throws it onto the Super X. It's awesome. That's one of the best scenes in the movie. It's just so cool to see him kind of be like, yeah, I don't know where you think you're going. He knocks it out of the sky, grabs this building, and pushes it straight down onto the Super X. It's awesome. I love it. So the Super X is destroyed. There are a lot more scenes of the humans than before, of the human damage than before. So you actually see a lot of humans getting running away, or they're running through the rubble. They're trying to help each other out of the rubble, getting killed. A lot more scenes of the human damage, of what's happening on the human level, than we've ever seen before in the series. The bird signal is completed and built by Hayashida. He leads Godzilla all the way to this remote island where Godzilla falls into a volcano. They detonate the bomb. The volcano goes off. Godzilla is defeated for the movie, but not killed. They make it very clear he's not dead. He's just going to be stuck down there for presumably a really, really long time. Well, the next movie he kind of makes his way out. I don't remember how, so I'm going to have to watch Biollante again, obviously, for the review, but I definitely don't remember how he makes it out of there. I think the volcano just kind of erupts again, and then he comes out. That seems awesome. I love that. I love that movie. So the human story in this movie is longer than it's needed, because although it is more interesting, they could have recut it at the very least to make it flow better. It doesn't flow very well. This movie has some severe pacing issues, as I keep mentioning throughout this whole review. It's just poorly paced. The music really doesn't help make it feel more entertaining. I think the English cut's pacing is a little bit better, but at the same time, with the English cut, you lose so much of the interesting stuff happening with the Japanese cast. It really makes me question, can you cut out enough of the Japanese story to make this movie better paced, and at the same time retain the interesting aspects of the character? I don't know if there's any good balance that there is to be found between the two. It's disappointing, to say the least, because this movie, I looked for it for years, and then I was somewhat disappointed by the poor pacing and just the overemphasis on the human characters, when really they are interesting enough, but there should have been less of them. Godzilla, he looks okay. I really like the new fangs that he has, just a throwback to 54, and the ears. I like the fact that we have a Godzilla with ears again, but I think the face kind of looks a bit stupid. I don't think the face looks good. Also, I know the picture on screen, Godzilla looks very green. That's actually because I wanted to make this picture stand out from next week's. Next week's is going to be almost like the SH Monster Arts variant versions of their figures. It's basically going to be the same picture but battle damaged, and then Godzilla's going to be a lot more screen accurate in that picture. The only reason I did that was to differentiate it so that you guys didn't have to look at the same picture 2 reviews in a row. It's the same thing that I did with 54 back when I did 54 and then 56. I just differentiated the pictures just to make them look a little bit different from one another. So I like Godzilla's design. He looks okay. I don't like the face. I think the animatronic looks alright. It doesn't really move correctly, but whatever. I think when Godzilla's far away, he looks great. I just think it's whenever you're close up to him, he does not hold up. What else? Godzilla's design is a total throwback to 54, which is great. And he's also charcoal gray in the movie, so I really like that. The music in this movie is alright. There's 2 good songs. The song about the Super X, and then the song that plays all the time, which is that ominous theme. They just should have used it at different points than when they did. So I think about 20 to 30 minutes of this movie could have been cut, or at least like 30 to 40 minutes of this movie could have been re-edited and maybe put different scores in there to make it work better, because it's not, like I said, the pacing issues are there, but they're not set in stone. You can put different music in there and it'll make it better. So a lot of people really like the score for this movie. I think it's okay. Like I said, the music works fine, but it doesn't work fine in a lot of the scenes that it's presented in. It would work fine in a different type of scene or in a build-up. I think a lot of this music in this movie is build-up, and I don't think there's enough climactic music in order to make it worth it. So, I think this movie could be reworked to make it better than it is, which is the disappointing thing. Overall, I know I kind of bagged on this movie a lot. I like it. I do like it. It's not bad at all. It has flaws, but those flaws, first of all, it's just the way I view it. It's just my opinion of the movie. Second of all, they could all be solved fairly easily, so I don't think any of the problems in this movie are really that bad because they're not set in stone. All I gotta do is I gotta take this movie, insert some different music, and I will enjoy it thoroughly, much more than I did the way that it's actually presented on the DVD because of the Japanese version. The release, it just isn't as good as it could be. The English cut is also not as good as it could have been, but we'll get there next week. So overall, I'm going to give this movie a 7.5 out of 10. I know that's kind of a lower rating than a lot of the previous Godzilla movies I've given. Obviously, I don't like this movie as much as I like a lot of the previous Godzilla movies, such as like Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla or the 54 movie, for example, King Kong vs. Godzilla, the only 10 out of 10 that I gave, I think, maybe other than the 54 movie. So I think this movie, go check it out if you're into these political, allegorical movies. Other than that, though, you're not going to find a lot of entertainment in it. Godzilla's not really on screen a ton. It takes about an hour and a half for him to come. Maybe not an hour and a half. Maybe an hour and a half. It takes anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half for him to actually make landfall in Tokyo. So there's not tons of crazy and entertaining things happening in this movie. It's really just more there to be a very interesting look at what would happen if Godzilla showed up in the modern world. And I guess modern being the 1980s. So I don't know. I think movies do this whole scenario better later to come, such as Godzilla 1954 did this better earlier. Shin Godzilla is going to do it better later. Godzilla 2014, I think, accomplishes this aspect better than this movie does. I don't know. I just think there's more that could have been done with this movie, and at the same time, you could have lost a lot and made it much better. So 7.5 out of 10. That's really it. That's all I got to say about this movie. This is one of my longer Godzilla-Thons, actually. I haven't done like a 40-minute Godzilla-Thon in a few weeks, so it's kind of good that I actually get to go on and on about a Godzilla movie again. So thank you guys all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. See you guys next time for Godzilla 1985. D-Man, out.